Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. When we were getting ready to broadcast today, and again, we always do this a bit after 12 noon on Wednesdays. Today's March 19th. When we were getting ready to do this, and Kate is usually the one who gives us kind of like an outline plan of what we're going to talk about, kind of a quick overview. We'll hit these three or four points. And the first point was the whole drama over the continuing resolution and the sort of the blowback at Chuck Schumer that came out of that. And it took me a moment to process the fact that that happened within the last week because it seems, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's another one of these examples of dilated time in the moment that we are living in. It was just a few days ago, really. So and I saw. I'm sure some of you saw Chuck Schumer went on Chris Hayes' show. That was sort of the first of these shows, at least that I saw, where he was, I think, in his mind, speaking to sort of kind of the base of the Democratic Party, as opposed to official Washington going on. I can't remember which shows he went on, but sort of Sunday shows and those kinds of things. And I'll be honest with you, I did not watch a lot of these interviews because I find them kind of uncomfortable, right? To watch them, because I sort of, I- you know, I think Chuck Schumer's a good guy. I think he's been involved in politics his life, and all this kind of stuff. I don't have enmity to the guy. Um, but I don't think he really kind of understands the moment that we're living in. And because of that, when I see these interviews, it's kind of awkward. I think I posted, I experience it as a little awkward. I think I posted yesterday somewhere on social media that even though I'm not you know, in the running to have Chris Hayes' job, I was glad that I didn't have it yesterday because I wouldn't have I would have felt I wouldn't have felt very comfortable having that interview. I would have, my version of that interview would have been to say, I don't really have any questions. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. We're done. And that would be my version of the interview because I don't think I don't think Chuck Schumer gets where we are, and I take no pleasure from digging into the fact that he doesn't get where we are. And I was talking to someone this morning, and what everybody's taken away from that Chris Hayes interview, if you didn't see it, if you haven't seen headlines out of it, is that Schumer basically said, "Look, our democracy will be in jeopardy if and when Donald Trump defies a Supreme Court ruling." And you know, a lot of very predictable and very correct responses to that of, dude, we're already here. Like why, why do you keep pushing, why do you keep pushing the the moment of destiny out into the future when we're already here? And I agree with that, but I look at it a little differently. I see it as less, kind of when is that point, and have we passed the point, or are we in the point, or is it still out there in the distance? I've never seen this "are we a democracy anymore or not" thing as a binary choice or a binary moment. It's not like that. It's incremental. And because of that, I am not and have never been terribly focused on where is that moment that we're no longer a democracy, where we have no choice but to push back, all this kind of stuff. I think the point is much more, um, we need to stop being reactive to each new successive offense, right? Being reactive is a whole thing in itself. What I see this as less kind of where is the line, as Donald Trump is in American football terms, he's at our 30-yard line, right? And I'm not waiting for him to like get into the red zone or score a touchdown. I want to start. I want to get some sacks. I want to force some errors. I want to for you know I want to force some turnovers. I want to do that right now. And I think the issue is that again I think Chuck Schumer and people who think like Chuck Schumer are in this mode of reactivity. At what point, and it's always, further into the future, are we going to stop operating by the normal rules of the road and do something that something is never is never discussed? But again, you're at the 30-yard line. I don't want them to get any more yardage. I want to, again, we're talking about a situation where in football terms you're playing defense, but you can go on the offensive when you're playing defense. You go on the offensive now because I don't want to give up any more yardage and I want to get the ball back, right? And I want to start doing things that they have to react to. So I think that is I don't know, that's my take on the Chuck Schumer thing and that decision that got made last week. So that would have been my version of the interview. I just would have given a little soliloquy, and I would have said, "Chuck, you got anything?" So with that in mind, Kate, what are you thinking um, about where we are?
Well, let's back up a little bit and kind of wrap up how this all played out. Because when we talked on Wednesday, it was really murky how things were going to go. You still had some sense that Democrats might take a stand. That was right around the time that Schumer said there weren't enough votes for cloture, which is a way of saying, Democrats aren't going to do this. Um, and it was a weird couple days because I went from feeling like, oh, this is doomed, to maybe something has changed, to then being up there for these long marathon days. And it was really like nothing I've ever experienced up there before. I've never seen Democrats so upset and so unwilling to talk to reporters. Like, even just small anecdotal things like, Brian Schatz wasn't taking questions and he's like, one of the chattiest ones there. You had little things like Elizabeth Warren was taking the trains when she usually walks everywhere. And, you're like, maybe that's unrelated and maybe that's because it's way harder to catch a senator when they're on the train versus when they're taking this long walk. So um, tons of no comments, tons of kind of see my previous statements. And the way these days would flow is there's this tight-lipped, you're getting nothing stuff. Then they go to lunch and you're sitting there and you're waiting outside and you can hear through the door sometimes like applause or as it transpired, Gillibrand shouting about how bad a shutdown would be. And then they go out and they vote, and then after the vote there's like a loosening up. Schumer has said, I'm going to address this. Everyone is a little more free with the exception of those undecided votes, like the people who ultimately helped advance the Republican bills. Those people were not saying much. But Schumer ultimately goes to the floor and kind of gives up, right? Says, I'm going to help advance the Republican bill, which is code for there are too many Senate Democrats who want to advance the bill. So, this is what leadership does. They kind of spread out their arms to be a heat shield for the people who want it. Sometimes whether or not they want to. But after that happened, there was a bit of a loosening from the hell no Democrats. They were willing to talk about it. Some of them were willing to question the tactics. Like Hickenlooper told a group of us that he's worried that come September, when this funding bill expires, it'll be really hard for Democrats to kind of use any leverage then because they already folded once. So you were getting tidbits like that. A big question was, have you lost faith in Schumer? I would say 100% across the board. Nobody that I talked to criticized him at all. It was very, even the hell no people said he was in a difficult decision, mm, that kind of thing. And then they voted to advance it. And there was like a little mini like frisson of drama there because the vote took forever. So there was some sense of like, oh, do they not actually have the votes that they said they had? But it passed, and then along the way there were these little mini dramas. Like you wrote about this, Josh, but the kind of weird, dumb lack of plan gambit was to demand a vote on a clean 30-day continuing resolution as an amendment to the Republican CR. So that amendment absolutely would have failed. Democrats don't have a simple majority of votes. But I guess the thinking was like, we can say we tried, we voted for this. I mean, it was weak sauce from the beginning, and it was never really going to work. And then Josh Kavinsky and I got the scoop that they were dropping that plan at the request of Patty Murray, whose CR it was, because she basically didn't want to be part of this kind of like spectacle theater type
Charade, sort
thing.
of, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then vote ended. People were sprinting from the room, from the chamber so quickly that Marsha Blackburn toppled over in front of all the reporters. And that's where things have been left pretty demoralized. Schumer was supposed to be going on his book tour. He canceled all those dates because of all the protests that were planned around them. Um, yeah, and I mean, Democrats have given up the only point of leverage they'll have until September. And it's kind of hard to see how this put them in a stronger position in September, where the lesson Republicans have learned from this is you can offer nothing and still win.
Let me back you up, and because I want to give, uh, well, not only our listeners, but sort of myself, because I haven't been up there in a very long time. You said that, and I think a lot of people saw reports from you and Amine and other reporters hearing shouts in the room. Give us a sense of the literal physical geography of those moments. You're close enough where it's a closed door meeting, but you can kind of hear what walk. How does that work?
Yeah, so the Democrats have been shifted because you get different lunchrooms if you're in the minority and majority, but both of them are right off the floor. The idea is you huddle with the caucus and then easy access to the vote kind of thing. So there's you're in this like very kind of ornate rococo room with these like unbelievable chandeliers and tile work and paintings on the ceilings and everything. And there are benches, decorative, uncomfortable benches that ring the room that you can sit in. And because if you're getting them on their way in and you're waiting to get them on their way out, you're kind of standing out there for like 2 hours, which is a long time. So you and Amine had clocked that earlier in the week, this one specific seat that's close to the door, the reporter there was really able to hear inside the room and was like getting kind of exclusive stuff from that. So we got there early so we would get that seat. Um and you're only a few feet away from the door. I mean, it's flanked by like Capitol Police, and they have the Capitol's press staff who are basically there to make sure you can't like trap senators. They're
Right,
always
like
kind of
physically,
like,
kind of like,
exactly. They're like, you
yeah,
got to
yeah,
give
yeah.
a path through. You can't block the elevators, that kind of stuff. So, in those parameters, you've got kind of the door on one side. Opposite it is, the way everyone's walking to get into the chamber. And then you have like, imagine at a wedding when the bride and groom are leaving, and you have the kind of like human flanking of the aisle to like cheer as they leave. That's kind of where all the reporters are, and then on these benches. So it's a weird thing because it got a lot more crowded towards the end of the week as more people wanted to be there for the vote, which had the really unfortunate side effect of making it a lot harder to hear what was going on in the room. But yeah, that's the curtain raise on the stake out there. And I mean, this is like such a who cares logistical stuff, but it is funny how there are some spots that you can stake out that I just detest because it's like everybody goes there because it's, maybe one of the two exits from the chamber. So you have a high likelihood chance of kind of hitting who you need. But the the walkway from there to an area reporters can't access is like 10 seconds. It's just you're not going to get anything because they know if they stop they'll get mobbed, and with
Right.
such a short walkway they can just, you'll say, well, what was decided in the meeting? They'll say, it was a good conversation. Boom, you lost your window, right? So I like really prefer these spots where it's kind of you get at least 30 seconds from place to place. But yeah, I mean that's kind of par for the course on a big day like this week when it's totally stuffed with people.
So the point is that depending on where you are, you can't know word for word what they're discussing, but you can get kind of a feel for, at least kind of some overview, and I guess even more a sense of just sort of the tone of the
Mhm.
conversation. I guess one thing, I said at one point last week that I thought Schumer was trying to bamboozle people, basically bamboozle not people up there necessarily, but people, members of the public who don't have as fine-grained an understanding of Senate procedure and all that kind of stuff, where he said, hey, we're kind of going to the mat here, and we'll only give up cloture, as you said, if you give us a vote on this amendment and stuff, whereas if you understand Senate procedure, like, dude, you're giving that just means you're giving up, and you're kind of coming up with this vote and kind of whatever. But what I want to ask you is, I think the question a lot of people on the outside had and still have is the question of how much of this was a bunch of senators who really didn't have the stomach for this fight, going through the motions to say they did and whatever, versus there being a lot of senators who really did not want to have the outcome that happened. And it certainly seems to me, on the basis of kind of what you just described and some other things, um, you wouldn't have the intensity of some of the arguments suggests that not everybody was on the same page here about how this was supposed to go down. So can you, obviously it's hard for us to know exactly where each individual person, but can you give us more of a sense of that, kind of how much this was a fight within the Democratic caucus?
I think it was genuinely an enormous fight, and I think people on both sides of it, you never got the sense that people were like, "Well, this is obvious." Like, I think there was a sense from even the hell knows that it was a lesser of two evils situation.
Mhm,
The people
mhm.
who didn't wanna support the CR were still really worried about a shutdown, and,
Yep,
you know, I mean, we discussed this on an earlier episode, but for some good reason. The idea that if it shut down, if millions versus the tens of thousands that like Doge has fired so far kind of get furloughed, you could just say and never come back. I mean, that's a real concern. A lot of people brought up this idea that they would just let some agencies shutter forever, not bring them back. So no, it was hard fought. It was hard debated. I think people on both sides of it felt really strongly. And the way that it shook out, it was something like 10 Democrats ultimately voted with the Republicans, and I think they only needed 8. And some of those members were, members of Schumer's leadership team, right? Like
yep,
there's been a big reaction to Brian Schatz voting for the Republican CR because he's, a progressive, considered to be one of these like he's a spring chicken in the Senate, he's a good communicator. Is kind of the vision of what people mean when they say fresh blood, new leadership kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I think people were a bit disappointed, but I thought that was more a reflection of the heat shield thing. Like they made the decision they're going to kind of like take as much flack for their colleagues as possible. One thing that I thought was interesting is this was not at all like an ideological split where you had all the moderates voting for the Republican CR and all the progressives saying no. It was much more complicated than that. And I think the swing statey kind of people you would expect to get tagged as moderates, whether they are or not, because that's the part of the country where they're representing. Like a lot of them, especially the new ones, did not vote for the Republican CR. Like I'm thinking Slotkin, Kelly, Gallego, people in these kind of vulnerable seats, while you had, Gillibrand. She's a New York
Yeah.
senator. She gets that job as long as she wants it, who votes for the Republican CR. So it I think that also reflects how much this was not it wasn't ideological as much as it was tactical and strategic, the nature of the fight,
Hmm.
which really kind of encompasses the whole thing we're talking about right now, because the whole fight over the Democratic Party is not we need more moderates or more progressives. It's attitudinal, it's strategic. Like people want, more quote unquote like progressive people in terms of the progressive brand is more fight oriented, right? And the moderate brand is more like decorum oriented. So it's interesting that the way this fight broke down was so kind of reflective of the greater battle over the Democratic Party now. And the thing that I wonder is if Schumer realized the extent of the fury that would follow this. I wonder if he kind of thought to some degree people would understand that this was a hard call, and that's what leadership does. It makes kind of hard calls to protect its members. But I mean, look at the cancellation of the book tour, right? That happened at some spots the morning before the event was supposed to take place. So that indicates a little bit that it was more backlash than he anticipated.
Yeah, that was I mean, a couple points you made. One is I just want to reemphasize, and this is something that I've wanted to get more into in posts and all this kind of stuff, that you see in a lot of the sort of the, inside DC news sheets and stuff, kind of there's a the left is rebelling against Schumer, or the progressives are mad, or the base is mad. And, base is a very loaded word. We mean all sorts of things by the base. But my sense of this, and I'm certainly not the only one saying this, is that, you have an ideological spectrum in the Democratic Party, and you have a fight slash institutionalism decorum spectrum. And they are not the same spectrums. And there is still, I think we're kind of at this point where you are getting it's starting to break through a bit that these are not overlapping spectrums, but it is telling the degree to which in most mainstream media coverage that's still assumed, right, that they're the same thing, and they're just not. And we don't even really have vocabulary for it, in the sense that, like, when we talk about who's not the progressives, the words that we normally think of are either centrist or moderate. Well, moderate is inherently kind of like, well, I don't want to go it is almost an inherent it is literally a non-fighting word. It's like, I don't want to go too far. I want to split the difference. That's what moderate means. You're kind of you're it's a bit of punch pulling. And, centrist is kind of the same thing. It is a kind of non-ideological middle point between the ideological poles in the country. So we don't even have a real vocabulary for anybody who is not a progressive, quote unquote, um, that we define in any way but being kind of a bit of a softie. right? And kind of wanting not to rock the boat. So I think that's one thing. I do hear a lot of people, and to some extent, I would, kind of share some ideological perspective with these people, who say, "Hey, I love that AOC is out there. She's talking the language that we all need to take. She's blah 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 blah. But hey, I don't want the party to be run by AOC because I don't agree with AOC and all her ideological positions." And I think with and again, I'm not anti AOC. I want a few people who speak for the party and have, kind of across the ideological divide, but all kinetic and combative. And what I've said to these people is like, well, if you don't want her to be the only voice, you need to have people who are in a slightly different place ideologically who are as combative as she is. You can't have it both ways, right? So that's one whole issue. On the Schumer part, I remember on Friday when he kind of, said, "Hey, I'm lowering the boom here. This is it. We've made a decision and this is the decision." And I remember thinking like, I don't think he grasps what he has opened up here. It kind of, I think I said this in a post. It reminds me of, there are those mini arcs in the Chernobyl miniseries, right? Where someone's already been irradiated. They're dead. They just don't know it yet, right? Because with severe radiation poisoning, it takes you a few days to die, you know. And I'm not saying that Schumer is dead politically, but I do think, you know, minority leader doesn't make like a huge press round like this or go into sort of make obeisance to Chris Hayes if everything's fine. I think he gets that everything's not fine. Like he's got a big problem here. Let me ask you one other question because I want to dig into this kind of what you saw up there. One of the big things that shaped all of this is that clearly, and I think Schumer actually admitted this at one point, kind of late in the game, they thought Republicans weren't going to be able to get this through the House. They didn't think this was going to come to them. And when it did come to them, they were totally unprepared. And that's a big problem because like you should have had a plan A. Um, as we know, everybody in the House, all the Democrats in the House, but Jared Golden, who kind of has a special dispensation, everybody kind of realizes he has no business holding that seat in the first place and kind of he can do whatever he wants. So basically, they were totally united. But I think there was also kind of a sense that the House people thought, hey, we can stand up and then we're just going to hand it over to the Senate people. They'll have to make the tough decision. And so there was a lot of anger in the House towards the Senate. But to what extent is your feeling kind of like even the House people were sort of on the other side of this, kind of having their cake and eating it too? Or were they just totally outraged as they said?
No, I think 100% they had the easier time here. I think the biggest beef between the chambers by the end was that there was clearly not great comms between Jeffries and Schumer, or at least things changed in the Senate quickly enough that Schumer kind of changed his thinking after Jeffries had already kind of been locked in. And you could tell because at the press conference on Friday, Jeffries was asked, should there be new leadership in the Senate? And he was like, next question, which yikes. But, he has a bit of a reason to be kind of peeved because he made everyone except for Golden take a hard vote, or at least not a cost-free vote,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And it ended up not being for anything. But by that same token, it was much easier to be a House Democrat on this vote. Like, there aren't going to be any headlines that are House Democrats shut down the government, right? Like, this wasn't going to be laid at their feet. So yeah, I mean, and I think there's also a spectrum there, right? Like, AOC was leading the House charge. She was doing like sending out all these messages of, the 30-day CR gambit is dumb. People aren't going to fall for that in the Senate. You got to do more. Like being very kind of explicit about the strategy and the tactics. And that's different than your kind of rank and file member, like who is more, you know, this is what leadership said we're going to do, kind of I'm going to do it. And there are certain people in the House who felt more kind of ideologically, but yeah, I mean, it's just easier to be the first link in the chain. And to some degree, it's not at all clear to me that House Democrats thought that these would be kind of important votes either, that Johnson had the numbers to pass it, because we've talked a million times about how close the margins are. But, this is the typical kind of thing where you'd have your Republican moderates be squishy because some of the cuts are punitive, and there's a big slashing of domestic spending and then like a huge giveaway to the Pentagon, right? And then you even have some of your right hardliners typically in this kind of situation being like, it doesn't cut enough. It's still, it's extending the Biden budget. I will never vote for that, right? So I think it would have been what previously conventional wisdom would have seen as safe money to think that Johnson would really struggle here. Um, and he didn't. I mean, he got it done fairly easily. There wasn't
Hmm.
even a
Hmm.
ton of like last minute
Whining at the
dramatic
end. Yep.
lobbying
Yep.
stuff. I mean, you had what Trump called and screamed at Victoria Spartz on the phone, which, sorry, you can't blame him there. She's like gotta be one of the most annoying members to have in your conference. So that was surprising to me. It really was.
The part of that that really stood out to me is that, I mean, one way to look at this is that, you know, Trump is back. His hold over the Republican Party is, 100 times greater than it was in his first presidency. He said to do it, and they did it. But there's an additional part of this that figures into that, and I think it is important to make note of explicitly, because it goes to the whole longer Doge impoundment situation that we're in. That the argument he made to them was, who cares if you're voting for Biden's numbers? I'm going to cut all that myself. I'm going to impound it. I am going to undo what you are nominally doing. So it's a free vote. You can vote for this with the perfect confidence that I, you know, illegally, I'm going to just go ahead and cut it because I'm king now. And they heard that and they're like, all right, that works. That works, my man. So it and again, I think it is really important to focus on that, because it shows how this extra constitutional moment that we are in is what allowed them to get past this obstacle that seemed like it would be really hard for them to get past, and they did.
Right. Which is also the flip side of, I just think, the strongest argument why Democrats made a mistake is that the idea that, well, the shutdown would let them, what do you mean let them? What's stopping them now? Like,
Yep.
you've got the lower district courts being kind of speed bumps in some spaces, like putting people back into their jobs for a few more
A
weeks
few
or a
weeks. Yep.
month.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, that's why, to me, I thought it came down to there are substantive reasons why you would vote either way. Like, I think that's fine. I don't think this was necessarily like super obvious on one side or the other. Like, I understand the concerns about the shutdown, but my sense was, I just think you're giving them way too much. You're giving the guardrails way more credence
Yep.
than they
Yep.
deserve. There aren't any of them. And then even when you add that to the ledger on the side of vote against the Republican CR, on top of it, then you layer on the politics, and the politics of voting for it are terrible. And I know that some of the consternation with the shutdown was, what do you do? What do you do in 3 weeks a month when the immiseration from the shutdown is really kicking in, right? There's no all the kind of finding money between the couch cushion stuff is over, and there are tangible effects, and people are being hurt, and they're crying out for help, right? And Trump says, don't care, don't like those people anyway, not worried about it, won't reopen. I think that was perhaps the biggest concern. What's the off ramp? Like, how do
Mhm.
Democrats win other than some kind of fantastical thing where Trump is like, "You're right, I'm getting rid of Elon Musk, and then we'll open the government up again." I think that was the concern. But there is
Yeah.
this thing that keeps happening within the Democratic Party, which is like foreseeing failure all the time, right? Like we have no idea what that would have looked like after a shutdown. And that's part of what's scary, right? Like politicians, I mean, at least Democratic ones are risk averse and they don't like the idea that you don't know exactly how that would have played out or who would have gotten blamed or whose constituents would have been hurt the worst. But the flip side of that is you don't know that you wouldn't have won. You don't know that they wouldn't have caved. You don't know that
Yeah.
there wasn't benefits to him of having the government open. They just kind of took this White House line of like, Elon Musk would love nothing better than a government shutdown and took it as ironclad fact when that is spin from the oppositional
Yeah.
team.
No, it is. There is something very disconcerting and weird that, as you said, the word out of the White House, like, oh, Elon is cannot wait for a government shutdown. He just told me he is psyched, and you back yourself into this position where you are actually saying to yourself that the real the real baller move here is to give them exactly what they're demanding. That will show them. And there were a lot of us saying, dude, step back and like say that again to yourself slowly, and think about if that is where you really are on the. I thought a pretty key moment that did not end up being a key moment was when the largest federal public employee union that I think represents about 400,000 out of 2 million, so it's not like it represents most of them, but it's the biggest individual one, put out this thing like, you can't sign this. And that spoke pretty powerfully, right? These are the people who are, this isn't a spectator sport for them. They are going to, whether they're furloughed or have to keep working, they will not get a salary, right? So this is like real for them, and they're saying you have to do it. The other thing again that comes out to me here is that a month ago, 6 weeks ago, there was when the question was like, okay, is that going to be the moment where you say, that's when the fight comes. That's when we're going to take this moment of power and do something with it. The strategy, such as it was, from Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, was we're not going to talk about this now. They're the ones who have to keep the government open. We don't want to come forward and start talking about a shutdown when why make ourselves the story? It's on them. Keep it on them. They're struggling. Keep the spotlight on them. The problem with that is staying totally silent is not always a great strategy, because you need to lay the groundwork on what you're doing. And in that, I think it was Thursday, in that period of an hour or so where Chuck Schumer went to the floor of the Senate and basically said, hey, you guys don't have the votes, where it really seems like kind of bring it on, Donald, John Thune moment. And I talked to a few very kind of close to the inside stuff people right after that. And I was like, wow, I kind of thought you guys were caving. Looks like you're going to rumble. And these people are like, dude, we're not rumbling. This is, we're going to do this for a day and then we're going to pass it. And I remember thinking like, what the fuck? Like, are you serious? Like, I was embarrassed at how much I was momentarily taken in by that speech. But the people who were kind of in those conversations, and some of them were sort of, 55% let's pass it, 55% let's have a shutdown, kind of recognizing it's tough all over kind of thing. But those people saying like, look, we should fight over this, but we haven't. It's too late. We've already, the train is passed. We have no, we're not prepared. We haven't even explained to our supporters why we're doing that, if we're doing it. We're just, it's too late. Um, and that was a pretty tough moment, because in a sense it was too late, because it put the senators put themselves in this situation of saying, hey, we really haven't explained why we would be doing this, but like, we're going to the government's going to shut down and we're going to do that, and what do you think? and and they were thinking like, how do we do that? And the simple thing is, you had to be saying 6 weeks ago, you're acting like a badass, saying that you are going to, you know, cut half the staff of the Social Security Administration. You're going to tell all the veterans, sorry, no more cancer treatments. You're going to do all this stuff. And right now, we don't have any power, but we are saying this is unacceptable. And when you come to us in 6 weeks and saying, hey, help us out, we're going to say no, because all of this is unacceptable. And we're going to keep saying it's unacceptable every day. And what's unacceptable? Why would we do that? Because people need to get their Social Security checks, and veterans need to get their health care, and this and that and the other thing. And then you come to that moment and you say, hey, we told you we're not going to let you not send everybody Social Security checks. And now we're at the crunch moment. And we don't want to shut the government down, but this is the moment. But they didn't do that. So they faced this pretty tough situation of just kind of out of the blue, kind of after the Republicans have been saying for 2 weeks, well, hope the Democrats don't shut the government down, of having that be the only thing that anybody is saying, and saying like, oh, no, we are shutting the government down. Uh, it kind of killed me. I was not the only person saying you got to talk about this in advance. Lots of people were. But it is that same story of, don't come up with some really baroque and seemingly ingenious plan, the upshot of which is we are going to be totally silent and not say anything. And that's our secret genius plan. Or our other secret genius plan is, we're going to do what Trump is demanding because that's the last thing he wants. Well, okay. I'm sure you had some really, you know, genius master's degree at the Kennedy School theory for why that made sense to you, but that does in fact not make any sense at all. So anyway, maybe this is
Bef-
something that people can think about next time we have a moment like this.
Before we move off this, there's one more piece I want to talk about, which is the fucking over DC contingent here. So part of the Republican CR basically just didn't include a line. So it would have forced DC to revert to last year's budget, which city officials have said would be, a $1 billion cut, which is massive for city government, and would have included firing police officers and, would hurt schools and would hurt the metro and everything like that. People were really freaked out, and city council members were doing like daily pilgrimages to the Hill to try to work this out. And on Friday before the vote, I was chasing around all the DMV senators. Asterisks, DC does not have its own representation, so all DC residents are completely disenfranchised, and so you have to depend on whether people in Maryland or Virginia care because they actually have voting representatives. So, I'm following them around, asking them if they're worried about this, and yep, we're working on a bill to fix it. That's what ended up getting passed. But then I also asked, what's your sense of was this a mistake or was this punitive? Because it is not at all clear on which of those two things it was, and I still find that really strange. And, my kind of totally unsubstantiated conspiracy theory might be that it was initially an oversight, but that's embarrassing to admit. So instead they're cloaking it in the, fuck over blue cities and democratic city governance kind of thing. But, when I asked Mark Warner about this, the senator from Virginia, he said, we went over to their offices when we realized this, thinking they'd be like, oh, our bad, we'll kind of fix it. And he was like, no, it was a pointed screw you. But then this bill, which basically just kind of nullifies that part of the CR, right? Like lets DC kind of move forward with its own budget, passes unanimously on a voice vote in the Senate. When is the last time anything passed unanimously on a voice vote that isn't like renaming a post office, I mean, any single Republican. Ted Cruz, Rand
Michael
Paul
Lee,
could
yeah.
could say no, force this to a roll call vote, and then you need, X number of Republicans to be on board with protecting the swamp, right? Like one of the biggest kind of bastions of liberal resistance. So that was pretty odd. And then immediately after the vote, you had reporting coming out that the White House supports the DC bill and that Tom Cole, the head Republican appropriator in the House, supports the bill. So that's kind of where my conspiracy theory came from, because if this was a punishing DC thing, why in the world would every Republican entity be like, yeah, no, we're good with protecting it now, Weird. And then kind of the latest on this, there was some reporting in Punchbowl this morning, the long and short of which was it'll be hard to pass this through the House where Republicans hate DC, except if Trump tells them to pass it, then it'll probably be fine. And that's where we are now.
Right, which is like, that's everything.
Exactly.
Everything is like, that's it's sort of like they're not going to pass it unless they want to pass it, kind of
Yeah.
like, okay, thanks for the insight, guys. Yeah, no, I was mystified how I kind of assumed, and it sounds like I assumed that wrongly, that when Schumer made this call, he basically said to John Thune, "Look, you have to help me on this DC thing," and that was, because look, at the end of the day, sort of to what I said before, Donald Trump didn't want to shut down. They wanted Democrats. I mean, how is it I even need to say this? Of course they didn't want to shut down. And since Thune was in the process of delivering what Trump needed, that I kind of assumed Schumer said that. Thune said okay, and he said to the White House, "Hey, just we're going to do this. This is going to push it along." I'm curious about. Honestly, it never occurred to me. Although I think you're right, that it never occurred to me that this might have originated as a slip up, um, because it is kind of a, reverting to the previous year. That's like a very indirect kind of, the consequences of it may have been great, but it's very kind of indirect and low energy. And I, the thing you said before about Warner's maybe back and forth, it also sounds like the kind of thing where maybe at the staff level, the Republicans are like, "Oh, sucks to be you guys." Whereas
Totally.
on the senator level, they're like, "Okay, that wasn't part of the plan, guys. Let's just fix that."
Right, and it's not hard for me to see a world where it's a mistake, then you have kind of Democratic officials panicked, like, groveling in Republican offices, and they're like, "Yeah, cry more, lib. This is awesome. This is so funny."
Exactly.
Before, as you say, someone along the way is like, "Well, we members of Congress live in DC
Yeah.
half of our lives, so maybe you don't want it to become into a total shithole even though the people in it vote for Democrats,"
That was actually part of what I was wondering about is that obviously a lot of, well, it's changed generationally. Obviously, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle live out in Maryland or out in Virginia, but a lot of people do live in DC. And just for people who don't know the area, what happens in DC does not stay in DC. If there's kind of a budgetary crisis in DC, that doesn't mean it's not going to affect Arlington or Bethesda. You do live there, so there's going to be a bit of a cross-cutting interest here. But this is an interesting segue to we've gone a little longer than we intended on this issue, but it's a segue to one of our next issues, because the fact that this DC budget thing is not actually done yet plays into this US Institutes for Peace thing. Who should introduce it? You want me to walk us through? You want to take it?
I'll do the quick
Yeah,
run through. Basically, this is a like extra congressional corporation kind of thing. It's set up as this like independent agency that actually Reagan signed into existence. Hilarious. With the point of, it's like to help figure out solutions to like violent global conflict. Okay. That's like its
like
whole
peace
shtick.
processes around the world kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And of course, as soon as the Dodgers see like Institute for Peace, they're like, oh fuck that. Definitely don't need that. Right. So this was part of that list, like with the Africa Foundation agency that we covered, that was, going to be struck off for savings. And, in some ways, and Josh, you can add the more kind of like DC specific details here, but in some ways, this unraveled like a lot of these have this hostile takeover thing where, the Dodgers kind of bust into the building, or they try and are repudiated, and then they come back the next day and they try again. And in this case, per the lawsuit, they're accompanied by the security company that was working with the institute, which the president of the board had ended that contract because he suspected that they were working with Doge, and so cut it off kind of in the midst of the first inklings that this was coming, right? When Doge was reaching out and trying to find out about the security in the building. And so they deactivated all these badges, and you have this kind of comedy of errors thing where none of the security guys can get in to let in the Dodgers until one shows up who still had like a physical key and not a key card, and let them in. And, the most terrifying line of the lawsuit is they head straight for the gun safe, dot, dot, dot. First thing they did when they got in. Which also I was kind of like, a gun safe in the Institute of Peace is kind of interesting. But so they do the takeover, they do the whole thing of the, purported firings, even though the people on the board have these removal protections. They can only be removed. There's a few various ways, but, like a majority on the relevant congressional committees wants to fire them, or a majority of the board wants to fire them, and they don't bother with any of that. They just do the whole, you're fired because we feel like it. Here's our new head of operations. It's what they are doing with all these kind of small, like helping other people agencies, which is break in, get the existing people out by force or by threat of force, install your own guy. His job is just to kind of get to work, canceling all the contracts, unwinding all the operations, firing everybody else who works there, and then shuttering it, right?
Yeah.
And Josh, you can kind of go through the way that this one was a little bit weird in terms of that whole force slash threat of force piece of the takeover.
Yeah, well, it sounds like, there's going to be a hearing on this that is about an hour away from when we're recording right now, and Kate has. I think Kate actually has some additional information that I don't know yet, based on the documents that are going to be part of that hearing. But at least as of yesterday, and I suspect this is still in the mix, that it seemed like they got the DC Metro Police to be a the kind of the use of force that gets them into the building. And people were pretty upset about this, because, like, wait a second, DC is, to the extent that it has a government of its own, is not like a Republican city government. So why is the police force of DC helping this, especially when this is essentially at this point, despite all of these constitutional dependencies, this is a property dispute. There are two entities that say they control this office, basically. So why was the DC police force, why did they do this? Why did they basically end up working for Doge? And the way this connects to what we were just talking about is that the members of the DC City Council, most of them, and specifically the member who oversees the police department, were basically said, "Hey, just following protocol here. I know everybody's upset, but hey, this is how it is." And the key here is that because of what we talked about a moment ago, with the DC budget tied to the CR and this new little mini bill to fix it and all this kind of stuff, Donald Trump has the government of Washington, D.C. by the throat. He can just decide at any moment, you know what? I'm not going to sign that bill. So it does suck to be you, however that little glitch in the language originated. And so uh, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal, right? The DC city government is right now, for some period of time, is in the position that I think people were worried, and still worried, that the New York City government was in, because we have a mayor who's being held hostage by Donald Trump, right? Um, it sounds, I didn't realize, you clearly have information about the role of the private security company that I did not know when I was writing this stuff yesterday. Now, was that the security company? In the initial reports, uh, in the news we had yesterday, that Doge showed up with what appeared to be a private security service in addition to some FBI people. So it sounds like you're saying that that private security company is the one who had an existing contract to work for the U.S. Institute for Peace, but they had sort of switched sides.
And there's a detail in the lawsuit that Doge had threatened all their federal contracts if they didn't help.
Perfect.
So,
That is where it all comes together. That is where it
right.
all comes together. That makes perfect sense.
But in terms
Perfect
of the
sense.
DC thing, someone said this on a podcast and it sounds melodramatic, but living in DC, you feel like you're living in a city under invasion right now, because you have the piece of, I mean, first you just have the normal like influx of Trump people around. You have the firings, which have
Hmm.
affected everybody to some degree. Yeah, now like you said, it's just like everything about the city's functioning feels totally vulnerable. And there's been a
Hmm.
ton of like internecine debate kind of more among DC residents of like what the city government should do. Like people were really unhappy that Mayor Bowser agreed to kind of like rip up Black Lives Matter Plaza, which was put into place, during the protests over George Floyd's death. And, got a threatening letter of like, we're going to come down on you if you don't do this kind of thing. Right. And she acceded and let it be ripped up and everything. And it's just a weird spot because DC has no leverage at all and is completely vulnerable. And the only salvation used to be because Republicans have been doing this to DC for forever. Like every single time there's a new appropriations bill, some like Yahoo Republican House member from wherever will be like, and also DC shouldn't be allowed to X. Sometimes these things are so stupid, like they shouldn't be allowed to ban turns on red lights because Congress members don't want to wait at red lights, kind of thing. And then you get this stuff of like, well, they shouldn't be able to have abortions and whatever. We should kill all the undocumented immigrants, whatever. But typically, Democrats say, well, no, we're not voting for that. So take it out so we can pass it. And that's how it goes. Like, it really did all come down to Democratic protection before. And
Yeah.
now with Democrats so unwilling to kind of use what little leverage they have, you feel like you've completely lost that protection as well. And the thing that just really galls me here, and I because we haven't said their names in a while, under Biden, there were enough Democrats to do a filibuster carve out to make DC a state. And we wouldn't be in this position, and DC would have self governance and probably be a really important site of pushback to Donald Trump, both because it
Hmm.
would be in the political interests of, the senators and the congressional delegation from DC, and because you wouldn't have to worry that, well, he might shut down the metro, if you don't kind of do what he says. But we don't have that because of Mansion and Cinema. And I just don't want that legacy to be forgotten in this moment.
Yeah, it's funny. I lived in DC for 5 years. And when I lived in DC, I lived in DC. And at the time, I certainly I thought DC should be a state then. Because of my history background, I've always been like a little uh, it, the existence of DC in the first place is a little odd. It's this weird kind of thing that was created without kind of a lot of thought about what would happen, a couple centuries later when a ton of people live there. But I thought it should be a state, but it was mostly notional. Like, okay, I can't vote for a single representative, but like it's kind of a notional loss. Whatever. I won't live here forever, and blah 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 blah. But what we've seen is that it has suddenly become not notional at all, not at all. And this situation, um, about until that little bill is passed, Donald Trump owns DC. I mean, and that thing with the Mayor Bowser and Black Lives Matter. I get why she did that. She's thinking like, look, this is a physical space, and I have a city that I need to make sure there's schools for kids to go to. Right? That is a so it has become not at all notional. And one big thing I did this post yesterday about the power of the states. And there's a clause in the Constitution that has usually been interpreted in a different way, and actually been interpreted as no one even thinks about it because it's so notional. The federal government guarantees to the states Republican government. And in some ways, by the modern usage, yeah, Republicans are totally down with that, right? But in the sense of what that really means in the historical sense is the rule of law. It doesn't exactly mean democracy, but you get the general idea. Okay. And generally speaking, that has been interpreted as suddenly there's I don't know, a dictatorship in Connecticut, that the federal government would have a responsibility to say, no, you have to go back to having a Republican government, being a democracy. Well, I have been thinking about, if Donald Trump is going to say to like the state of New York, okay, we're pulling all of your funding just from you, unless you do this one thing that I want. Well, that's not Republican government, because Republican government means that the elected officials get to make judgments, that their own judgments, not be held hostage. Okay. That's a whole other thing. The point is, to the extent that that kind of reasoning becomes operative, DC doesn't have that. DC doesn't exist, right? It's just a kind of a place where the federal government is, that has a kind of a very small uh, self government now, but it doesn't have anything like that. I guess Donald Trump could he could do what he's talking about, like with Gaza. He could just say everybody's got to leave. I'm the king of the federal government. Out, right? And that's so it's not notional anymore. And that is not again, having a member of the House is kind of like, okay, I don't have a member of the House, like whatever. I don't have to live in this one little pocket of American territory. But uh, people who live in DC are kind of owned by Donald Trump for the moment, and that's not workable.
And not least because, just to end it, but DC is like just like New York. I mean, they're kind of like avatars for what Trump hates, right? I mean, this is all part and parcel with what they're doing to federal workers because they
Hmm.
have in their
Hmm.
minds a federal worker is a person who lives in DC, who hates Trump, who votes against Trump, who marches and protests against him, who flips off the motorcade or whatever, or who works in these institutional obstacles to his complete takeover of the government. I mean, it's all punitive, right? That's
Hmm. Hmm.
wrapped in, that's part of it. So, yeah, I mean, a vulnerable DC is obviously scary for me as someone who lives here, but also because we're we're in his reach, he can punch and he can reach us in a way that maybe like, California is a little more protected. So, this all goes to the same point of why the 750,000 people in DC should have self-determination and the full rights as US citizens, especially as we're paying the most taxes per capita. But this is the downside when you don't give people their full gamut of rights. It makes them really easy to take advantage of. And, you hear endlessly about the swamp and everything, but DC is obviously the nerve center of the government. And when things are broken here and people with institutional knowledge are booted or forced out, it's not going to be that long before those trickle down effects are felt. And my concern is I don't know that people in other parts of the country care about DC. Republicans have done such a long smear campaign that maybe they don't. But my concern is that now this like starving the beast thing, right? Where like you fire all these people at the SSA and kind of the Democratic hope, right? Is that's really unpopular and that blows back against Trump. But what if you do that and then it makes people think, wow, this program kind of sucks and then makes it much easier to cut, I mean, this is not a well articulated point. This is just all the kind of like floating maelstrom of stuff that I've been thinking about that swirls around, these kind of attacks.
Well, just one final point to conclude on. I did a post yesterday. I can't remember the day before that about the fact that Democrats are out of power in the national government, but there's lots of legitimate power in the country that is not the national government, and that's in the states, and that is a really key thing. And the fact that we are a federal system means that federal law is supreme, but the governor of New York does not work for Donald Trump, right? It's the governor is not an appointee. The office can't be abolished. All this kind of stuff. So that is just a fact, right? And that's a big fact in a moment like this. But DC has none of that. It has none of that. And that is it's another way of saying the same thing, but it's an important way to say it. Again, there is no way. There's lots of things that Donald Trump can do, but there's no way that Donald Trump can fire the governor of New York or California or anywhere else, or like say, okay, we're consolidating California with Pennsylvania. That doesn't, again, not can't do that. Um, but all of those things, you could do that in DC. And again, it's just in this kind of dictatorial moment. That's got to be the first moment when Democrats have even the theoretical possibility to change this. They have to, because again, it's not notional anymore. It's real. So, okay.
All right.
Is
On
that
that
it?
note, yep,
Yeah,
that's
on
it.
that note, that's all we got, and we'll talk to you again next week.
See you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor in chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.